Well, here we all are. Hi, everybody. Hi, South by. It's good to see you, though virtually. I'm Moira Whelan. I'm the Director of Democracy and Technology at the National Democratic Institute, which is a nonprofit organization based in Washington that strengthens political processes and democracies around the world. And welcome today to our panel conversation, the best practices of the worst people. The worst people are not joining me today. These are the best people talking about the worst people. But I'd like to introduce you all to Laura Cunningham, who is the CEO and president of the Open Technology Fund, which we'll tell you all about in a moment, and Adrian Shabazz, who is the director of Technology and Democracy, because we just reverse our titles here in Washington at Freedom House. So the three of us are part of a much larger community that works to defend democracy in the technology space in a whole number of ways, which we'll talk to you about today. And the reason we wanted to present this information here at South by is because this community to us really represents what you can do with a free and open internet and the creativity and innovation that can disrupt economies, elevate educational opportunities, and even address a global pandemic. But we're here to talk today about the ugly underbelly of this world, because the same tools have been used by bad guys around the world to do everything from disrupting elections, to allow hate speech and violence, to turn the digital world we love into a dumpster fire. And that's happening around the world and pretty actively in many of the countries that we'll talk to you about today. Specifically, dictators, illiberal actors consider technology not only useful, but a go-to first line of defense in trying to preserve the authoritarian regimes that they're running. And in 2019 alone, we saw 1,706 days of internet access disrupted or shut down, 213 internet shutdowns in 33 different countries. So it's pretty much par for the course that Adrian, Laura, and I will see something in Myanmar, Chad, and Hong Kong, and that's pretty much just this week. I probably missed a few, where individuals, either whole societies are being shut down or individuals are being targeted from a surveillance and a cyber attack perspective that then turns into real life in terms of arrests, abuse, and targeting. So we're going to talk about that today, and we're going to talk about, we're going to ask our guests, Laura and Adrian, to put themselves in the shoes of their opponents by telling us about how not only these dictators do their work, but also how they're working together. And a little bit about the merry band of people who are combating them on a daily basis. So with that, I want to start and let them tell a little bit about you. One thing that we're really lucky to have in this conversation is that we've got some big picture perspective and we've got a very on the ground perspective, which is why I'm happy to have both of our guests here today. So Adrian, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and Freedom House?
Of course, thanks so much, Moira. I'm happy to have the chance to think like a dictator for a day and get away with it. So I'm the director of tech and democracy here at Freedom House. We're a nonprofit organization that identifies emerging threats to freedom and then also provides direct support to human rights defenders around the world. We were actually founded in 1941, so we're coming up to our 80-year anniversary. And one of our original co-chairs was Eleanor Roosevelt, who also headed the drafting committee for something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that's sort of part of a foundational document of the United Nations and much of the international order. It outlines a set of principles and values that then governments have committed themselves to for upholding human rights. And it's interesting that 70 years after the passage of that document, governments at the UN adopted a resolution stating that the same rights held by people offline must be protected online. And that's sort of the foundation of then a lot of our research and activities around internet freedom. a lot of the research that we do is centered on a report called Freedom on the Net. And this is our annual report on obstacles to access, limits on content, and also violations of internet users around their free expression, free association, or their right to privacy. And unfortunately, in all of the years that we've been doing this report, we started in 2009, we found a decline in global internet freedom. So in 2020, we had the 10th consecutive year of a decline. Obviously, or perhaps unsurprisingly, a lot of the decline this year was around COVID-19 and the impact of the pandemic. And through our research with working with activists, researchers, and journalists in the countries that we cover, we found that many governments are using the public health crisis as a cover to expand surveillance and data collection. We also saw that political leaders are using COVID-19 as a pretext to crack down on free expression. We saw many governments that are blocking access to independent journalism or arresting individuals for simply questioning the government's response to the pandemic. So unfortunately, we come at this at a stage where the dictators have really caught up. They're starting to learn how to manipulate and restrict the internet. And that, in the end, has signaled really a crisis for human rights in the digital age.
Thanks, Adrian. And Laura, it's kind of nice. We go from like Freedom House, been around forever, to OTF, which is the new kid on the block. So tell us about OTF and tell us why you made it.
Yeah, thanks, Moira. So as you said, I'm the president of the Open Technology Fund. Unlike Freedom House, OTF was actually just established as an independent nonprofit in 2019. So we are the new kids on the block. However, prior to that, we had been a small program at a larger organization for about 8 years. So we've been involved in the internet freedom community for a very long time, but finally kind of able to do that work independently and kind of bring the full support that we feel like this community really needs and deserves. So OTF's mission is really building off what Adrian said, to protect human rights online. And we do that by focusing very much on kind of the technical issues surrounding internet freedom. We support and invest in the development of technologies that provide free and secure access to the internet. So circumvention technologies, security and privacy technologies that allow journalists, human rights defenders, and just everyday users who are living in repressive environments to access the internet openly and safely, just like we would expect to here in the United States. In addition to that, we work very closely with a lot of organizations and individuals actually living in these countries to make sure that we are not only providing them with the technologies that they need to be able to express themselves and exercise their human rights online, but to provide them with the support and resources and training that they need to do so safely. And so today, actually, over 2 billion people around the world rely on OTF supported technologies to safely and openly access the internet. And we can talk a little bit more later about whether I think that big number is a good thing or a bad thing.
Thanks very much, Laura. And I wanted to give you a chance because for those of you who do end up Googling Open Technology Fund, you will find all sorts of interesting stories about it. So tell us about your last year and sort of the situation you're in now.
Yeah, it was an interesting year, to say the least. So like I said, in late 2019, OTF was stood up as an independent nonprofit. With the very big dreams of expanding support and resources to the internet freedom community and the journalists and human rights defenders that we work with in many of these countries. Unfortunately, those aspirations were very quickly cut short in early 2020. OTF is funded through a US agency called the US Agency for Global Media. And we receive all of our funding and our oversight through that agency. In June 2020, a new CEO was appointed by the Trump administration to run the US Agency for Global Media. And he quickly and continuously took actions essentially to destroy OTF. So in June 2020, both myself and our former CEO, Libby Liu, were fired by that CEO. We then had our entire independent bipartisan board dismissed, and we were stripped of all of our federal funding. As a result, not only did that put our organization obviously in a very harrowing situation, but we had to issue stop work orders to all of the projects that we were supporting around the world. At that time, we were supporting about 60 projects and only had to issue stop work orders to 80% of those, which meant the circumvention tools, the secure communication tools, the digital security training initiatives that we had been supporting in places, just like you said, Moira, in places like Hong Kong, in places like Belarus, in places like China and Iran, came to a complete halt in a matter of days. And our projects were left without the support and the funding that they needed to continue those incredibly important initiatives. I won't belabor the 9 months between those early days in June and now. But what I will say is that OTF was incredibly, incredibly lucky, not only to have the support of our board, but the amazing internet freedom community behind us, who not only supported OTF to kind of continue going, but supported us to file 2 lawsuits against USAGM for the actions that they were taking, and really to fight to preserve and protect OTF and the resources that we had been given to support the internet freedom community. And fortunately, the story has a good ending, which is that in January of this year, USAGM had its CEO replaced. So there is now new leadership at USAGM who has worked incredibly quickly to restore all of OTF's operations and kind of normalize our relationship. All the actions that had been previously taken against OTF have been either nullified or rescinded, and our funding has finally been released. So it's actually a great week to talk about this, because this Monday was the day we got to reopen all of our funding rounds and really completely resume normal operations. So that's been incredibly exciting. I would say it's not an experience I would certainly wish on anyone. But I think the really kind of good news, or if I had to pick a silver lining from any of that, was I think the last 9 months really helped to highlight how critical the technologies that OTF supports and that our community supports really are. A lot of times I think it's easy to take for granted the technologies that you rely on every day. I do with normal technologies, and I know many people do when it comes to circumvention and security tools as well. And I think, unfortunately, having all of those tools and resources suddenly stripped away really drove home how integral and frankly, how essential those technologies have become to journalism, to human rights, to just freedom of expression in a lot of countries where that is being cut off. And so, despite the challenges of that experience, I think it really helped to highlight the critical nature of this work and the importance of these technologies going forward.
Thanks for that, Laura. And yeah, it's going to make a great South by panel next year in person to hear all the war stories after you write the book. But we're on the other side of it. But it's, when you're supporting frontline human rights activists and then you become yourself a frontline human rights activist, it's an interesting dynamic. But I want to stay with what you said at the beginning there, or right at the end there, and about the reality on the ground that journalists and democratic actors face, and the importance of technology to their work as they're facing off against authoritarian regimes and dictators. And generally leaders, some of whom claim to be democracies, who are just more interested in keeping control than letting people have an opinion and letting people operate freely. So I want to start that off by putting both of you in the hands of the adversary, in the mindset of a dictator, and tell us why dictators care about the internet. We've all seen economies and businesses thrive with a free and open internet. So why would you want to shut it down? What do they get out of this?
I can
Adrian,
start
you
us
want to
off.
kick us off?
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. So again, putting my dictator hat on, which I've lost, so I can't put it on. But you know, it, they're generally afraid. There's this concept from many decades ago called the dictator's dilemma, which had been how do dictators and how do closed societies adopt new technologies, modernize their societies, for the economic and educational benefits that that brings, without ceding control over what people are saying and doing, not only online but offline as well. And so there's been, I think China is the best example of a country that is trying to, of a government that is trying to have it both ways, and in some ways could be seen as succeeding. But around the world, we often see that, Moira, you had brought up these network shutdowns. They often happen around protests, around elections, particularly ones that are flawed, and as well as during instances of police violence where the authorities do not want images of their police brutally putting down, a peaceful protest broadcasted not only to their own citizens but to people all around the world. What's interesting is that there is this very harsh collateral damage. So when the internet goes out, when people can no longer have access to crucial tools that are necessary for, especially during a pandemic, for finding out what they should be doing, what they shouldn't be doing, where are safe places to go. It's cutting people off from friends and family. People are losing access not only to things like social media, but oftentimes if the internet is going out, they can't go to ATMs, they can't access educational materials, even certain phone or television services that are based, online. Banks lose the ability to communicate, or businesses lose the ability to communicate with their customers and suppliers. You name it. This affects every industry. And there have been some studies that have tried to quantify that economic impact of something so drastic as a network shutdown. And they took Sudan as a case study. And Sudan is a country that where the government took down the internet for around a month at the height of some anti-government protests for, just simple things like dignity, that then led to a longstanding dictator being removed from office. And now there's a transition towards a more democratic government. And some of the researchers had estimated the economic damage of that internet shutdown around $1 billion. Which had, I think around 1% of the country's GDP. So it is really significant. And I think that's why a lot of governments are very cautious about just shutting down the internet altogether, because they are aware of the economic or the political impact that will have. And so some governments are moving towards adopting some more sophisticated tools for controlling online information.
Laura, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, just really quickly to say, I think that you two both hit it exactly. I think the one word that really answers this question is control. I think more than anything else, dictators are driven by their desire to maintain their power. And the way that they see doing that is through control. And, where you pose the question, but what about the economic benefits? What about the societal benefits? And I think we've seen throughout history, regardless of whether or not the internet exists, it be the case over and over again that dictators are willing to put their power and their desire for control above all of those other aspects of the well-being of their societies, of the well-being of their citizens. And I think we're just seeing that same pattern play out now in the digital age. The other thing that I think makes the internet really unique when we think about this is that it has really now become the global platform on which norms are being, created, redefined, tested. It's not only about kind of controlling things domestically. For a lot of these governments, it's now becoming how they think about normative structures globally as well. A lot of that used to be defined behind closed doors. A lot of that used to be defined exclusively by governments. And so to see that kind of control and power not only being challenged domestically, but internationally as well, I think is a very significant threat to a lot of dictatorships. And, as Adrian said, the internet has become kind of so central to how citizens engage with their governments. It's how many people now understand history and current events. It's how we access education. It's how we connect with other people and mobilize. And being able to control that, being able to control history, being able to control how people understand the societies that they are living in, is hugely important if you're thinking about how to maintain power. And so I think that's the big answer to this question, is that at the end of the day, control is going to be the number one thing that a dictator is going to prioritize over anything else.
Well, and it's really fascinating for those of us, for those watching, the example Adrian gave of Sudan. The roots of that came from basically women who were checking up on their boyfriends and husbands, and it became a revolution that threatened and overthrew a dictator. So just the act of wanting to better your own personal life ends up being a revolutionary thing to dictators. So they're afraid of it. But I want to acknowledge that not all dictators are the same, right? You have your dictators bent on global world domination, which the aspiring dictators, versus your sort of run-of-the-mill authoritarian who wants to keep control and power in their own country. So do they have a club? Are they working together? How are they, do they have Zoom calls where they get together and talk about ways to control Zoom? And talk a little bit about what we're seeing in their approaches to technology, how they differ based on the national objectives or the objectives of the regime. Adrian, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. In some ways there are clubs where they are getting together and talking this through. I mean, there's for nerds of internet governance, there's a lot of conferences where people get together to talk about the future of the internet and how it should be ruled. There's a cohort of governments, perhaps best represented by the governments in China, Russia, Iran, and other authoritarian countries, who really want to insist on greater government control around how the internet is run. And that differs from defenders of a free and open internet, which is, for a long time, the US has played an outside role in defending that and promoting that. It's part of the reason why we have the internet that we have today is a lot of the work of not only people inside government, but perhaps even more so outside of government, within the technical community, volunteers who have created a lot of the technical protocols for how the internet works. What has happened, though, is that many governments, embrace this open internet, and then they've sort of seen that it can be threatening to their power, and they've been like, oh, what have I just done? Let me try to put the cat back in the bag, so to speak. And the best example of who they're all following is the Chinese Communist Party. And that's because, from very early on, they made sure that the way that the internet was going to be run in the country was going to be in the hands of the state. And I mentioned, China and how internet controls have evolved. And I think that that's a really interesting metaphor for what other countries are going to be doing. And so they were actually the first country to shut down the internet entirely. It was back in 2009. It was around protests and in some cases riots in the region of Xinjiang, which is home to a group of people called the Uyghurs, who have suffered a lot of oppression and are currently being detained en masse in these very large detention camps, where they're oftentimes subject to torture and other types of violence. And instead, the Chinese government, instead of taking that sort of blanket approach, they have then spent a lot of time and money on fine-tuning this great firewall, where they are essentially, they have all sorts of laws, technical infrastructure in place to scrub the internet of anything that could be deemed as sensitive information that could, get people thinking independently about the Chinese Communist Party or how things should be run. And then at the same time, they've cut off the rest of the country, or they've cut off the country from the rest of the internet. Thankfully, we have tools, that many of them that have been inspired or supported by the OTF, that allows people within China to jump that great firewall and to access information outside of the country that is, more independent and has a different view around, let's say, what happened around the Tiananmen Square. But we saw that that great firewall go into effect around the pandemic. There were over 2,000 keywords that were sort of automatically scrubbed. So when you're on WeChat or other Chinese-owned social media, if you send certain messages that contain like a banned keyword, those messages just don't even go through. You then have people who are just monitored. There was a group called Chinese Human Rights Defenders that documented almost 900 cases of people being punished for just innocuous material that they had posted around COVID-19. That was just in the first 6 months of the crisis. So unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of other countries move in that direction of going from this, on the one hand, taking a blunt approach to how they're controlling the internet, to then more of an invasive approach where they're using things like censorship, manipulating online conversations, and monitoring individuals to allow for some type of discussions and free flow of data. But as soon as it crosses the line, then there's a very heavy-handed punishment against those individuals that have crossed the line.
Well, and I wonder, Laura, if you can walk us through that for a moment in terms of what actors on the ground are telling you. Like we kind of, we think of a journalist more in the framework of all the president's men sitting in, not typewriters anymore, but sitting in newsrooms. And, we're now dealing with a situation where, because of the growth of these technologies, they're able to do really innovative things, but they're also facing surveillance in a real, it turns them more into Jason Bourne than journalists. And I wonder if you can talk to us, just give us their perspective a little bit about how they're facing off against these dictators.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and it's a good one this week, actually. So Monday, as you guys know, was International Women's Day. And last week, there were 3 women journalists murdered in Afghanistan. And I say that because I think it really helps to highlight the very real risks that a lot of journalists are taking every day around the world, literally risking their lives. And especially for a lot of women journalists, that is very much the case. And so I will talk about it from a technology perspective for the purposes of our panel, but these risks are so significant and they're so real. And I think technology is making those even more complicated and a lot harder as well. So just to kind of walk through, like, what does a normal journalism kind of pipeline look like? So just being a journalist, just the title in and of itself in a lot of the countries that we are talking about is going to put you under advanced scrutiny and very likelihood surveillance. And that can be both physical surveillance, having yourself or family members tailed. It can also be digital surveillance through, malware and spyware and other digital technologies. So you're first operating in this world where you know that you are under constant scrutiny for any actions that you're going to be taking. And then just even to start writing a story, you're going to have to communicate with sources. Most of those sources are probably, in very sensitive situations themselves. And you're now putting yourself in a place where you not only have to communicate with them, but you are responsible to some extent for protecting their safety and their privacy as you engage them on the story that you're writing. So having, secure communication technologies to be able to do that is essential. Otherwise, suddenly you are exposing not only yourself, but other vulnerable individuals and groups in the process. Then on top of that, now you have the information. a lot of sensitive information as you're writing the story that you have to be able to keep safe. That is, we think of it in a technical perspective as kind of a honeypot, but you have this information that is going to necessarily be a target, likely of your government, and thinking about how not only that information needs to stay safe for your story, but for the individuals who are impacted by the data or the information that you have. And then, if you are so lucky to get through the process of, finding sources who are willing to communicate with you, doing that safely, coming to a story, then oftentimes, even once you're able to publish that story, it is immediately censored or your website is attacked. So after all that work to get a story out and to shine a light on something, then even getting that to the audience, making that heard becomes a huge challenge now in the digital age when most people are relying on the internet or mobile technologies in order to access news and information. And then the unfortunate reality after all of that is that there is, for many journalists, retribution that they face for the work that they've done or the stories that they've written. A lot of times that includes things like arrests or device seizure. So imagine having someone show up and pick up your laptop or your mobile phone and demand all the information on that. Those are not only sources' names, those are not only, the people who have been involved in your story, but those might be personal contacts as well. It's terrifying to think about how much information we store in those places and how quickly that could be accessed or exposed. And so there's that element of actual physical security as well. And I think that's kind of what I think about in terms of the journalism pipeline. But the last thing I want to highlight, and I think this is so acute right now for women journalists, is also online harassment. It's horrifying to me, frankly, to see so many women journalists who are publishing amazing investigative journalism, exposing horrible human rights abuses, only then to be harassed online by either government trolls or non-state actors. We are seeing women journalists who are being very personally attacked and threatened for the work that they are doing, regardless of the story that happens, in hopes of, stimulating self-censorship, in hopes of scaring them, in hopes of making sure that they stop, the important work that they're doing. So all that is to say, as a journalist in many of these countries, every single step you take is hard. Every single step you take in the process is a risk. And in many cases, that ends with even up to putting your life on the line. And really that for me is kind of one of the big premises and bases for OTF, which is that if there are journalists and human rights defenders and brave citizens out there who are willing to do that work, to take all of those risks, to shine a light on abuse, or to hold their governments accountable, it seems like the very least that we can do is make sure that they have the tools and technologies they need to do that as safely as possible.
I'm really glad you brought that up, and especially around harassment of women. It sort of brings us to our next point, which is that a big goal of doing that to a journalist is to chill speech, to quiet somebody's friends around them, keep their family. It's easier just not to disrupt things. Just go about being a dentist or a school teacher and don't worry about it. Just keep your head down, live your life. And that is really a narrative that a lot of dictators are selling their populations, that there's a trade-off here. You can have all the cat videos you want. You can have conversations about your favorite pop stars, but pop stars aren't allowed to criticize the government. And don't you think that's okay? Shouldn't they just be pop stars and not criticize the government? And, we're really seeing, and Adrienne, I wonder if you can kick us off on sort of talking about this phenomenon where dictators are getting more sophisticated about selling that trade-off to their populations and then teaching it to other dictators to sort of bring it into their own country. So you have a little bit of voice, a little bit of criticism can happen, but not so much that it becomes, it's like polite disruption. But can you talk a little bit about the dynamics we're seeing around there? And I think the big thing would be, is it working? Does that work?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that in many ways it's not working. And there's maybe two pieces of evidence that I would put there. So on the one hand, we can see that in many countries out there where that is what the dictator is selling, the people aren't buying it. And I'm thinking about, Hong Kong, Belarus, we already mentioned Sudan, Myanmar, where there's, a military coup. There's many different countries out there where people are not buying this, just keep your mouth shut and be happy with what you have. On the other hand, probably because people aren't buying it, we're seeing an increase in arrests and a crackdown on free expression around the world. So Freedom on the Net, it covers 65 countries, which translates to roughly 90% of the world's internet users. And among those 65, we found that governments arrested their own citizens for like nonviolent political, social, or other types of really innocuous expression in 49 of the 65 countries, and that's a record. So every year that we have been doing this report, we have seen a rising crackdown on free expression online. The point I want to make too is, this isn't always these courageous, brave activists who are getting ensnared in these laws. These are everyday people. These are, in Iran, it's tech bloggers. These are people who are just writing have their own tech review site and are then accused of conspiring to take down the regime. In Saudi Arabia, it's people who are live streaming about women's rights to drive. Even though then the government grants them the right to drive, they still target some of the activists who were vital in creating that movement. In places like Egypt, it's members of the LGBTQ community just for expressing themselves, or a picture where they're seen at a concert holding up a rainbow flag. So it's just everyday people who are getting caught up in this. And so I think what we need to understand is if we were living in these countries, we would be the ones who are being prosecuted. It's not just, the super high profile people, it's the private conversations that we're having with our friends and family. It's the things that we're reading, the protests that we're going to, whatever it might be. It's really affecting everyday people. And that's where I think it's the fact that the internet has really created new spaces for expressing oneself and for civic organizing. The trade-off is that a lot of these spaces are highly monitored, and people aren't yet familiar with the ways that being active and engaging in these spaces, particularly when you're living in a closed society, can actually put you at risk. Thankfully, there's a lot of people who are building the tools, and I'll credit OTF and Laura here that tries to make sure that people are safe when they are engaging online.
Well, and you touched on one thing that we've seen a proliferation in that I hope you can both talk about. It's like, we like to think of dictators as like a guy sitting on it's always a guy, by the way, but we like to, sitting on a throne, just telling everyone what to do. But what we see is they're sort of hiding behind this normative frameworks and standards, and they're creating cybersecurity laws. We've seen a proliferation of that in the age of COVID, where, these are health surveillance tools to help prevent the spread of COVID and also monitor your every movement. And I'm wondering if you can talk about, because to me, that proliferation is really the sign that dictators are sort of getting, digging into this. It's not just us versus them. They're here. We're all at the same parties, and yet they have a completely different agenda than we have, right? And they're using laws to control their own societies, close off their own communities and their internets, and, make it look like they're just trying to make the world a safer place, when actually they're restricting movement of everyday individuals. So can you talk a little bit about that? That, you know, not everybody is North Korea. There's a lot of these like democracy in name only countries out there, and sort of what we're seeing with the proliferation of these laws and how we get at it.
Yeah, Moira, I'm happy to start on that one, because I think the proliferation of laws is really concerning, and you've highlighted that well. My bigger concern actually is that you mentioned that, you know, governments are trying to kind of hide behind norms. And I think that is becoming less and less the case. And that to me is the most troubling trend that I've seen in the last couple of years. When I, you know, started this work a little over a decade ago, I think there was that kind of normative constraint. I think governments were trying to kind of hide or pretend that the laws that they were putting in place around technology and infrastructure were to protect people, that they were consistent with kind of democratic principles. You know, a government would censor a number of news websites and then say, oh, it was an accident. Oh, there was a technical glitch. Or they put laws in place and they would say, you know, well, this is to protect women. Oh, well, this is, you know, to protect, name your favorite group of people. It was all in that context. There was a lot of pressure then to make sure that the things that governments were doing and saying when it came to technology at least looked like it was consistent with kind of human rights and democratic norms and principles. There are still some governments that are trying to do that, but I think that is becoming shockingly less and less the case. I think those normative constraints are not as strong as they were a decade ago, and that is leading to both the proliferation of the laws that we're seeing now that are restricting, you know, free speech online, that are enabling things like real-time mass surveillance, but that governments, especially those who are, you know, authoritarian or kind of on the line between authoritarianism and democracy, are allowing them to be a lot bolder about what they're doing. You know, we see governments just outlawing VPNs. We see governments degrading or outlawing encryption. We see governments putting in place surveillance and censorship laws that say they are just there to do that. And to me, that is the really scary trend in all of this. It was one thing when it felt like, you know, there was actually a constraint around respecting human rights and the laws that were being put in place. The fact that those shackles seem to come off to a certain extent and are being led by, you know, governments like China and Iran, who are just very bold about the actions that they are taking, I think that's the thing that we need to be most concerned about in the years going forward.
If I may just add on to that, Laura, it's interesting that this trend coincides with, on the one hand, the rise of China as an actor on the international stage, and on the other hand, some, at least, you know, we'll see what happens over the next couple of years, but at least the falling back of the United States from global leadership. And I think that for people who think that, you know, who have bad memories of the United States and from, you know, the 2000s, and perhaps, you know, intervening in foreign wars and in foreign countries where they shouldn't have been. There is this other side of the equation, which is that when the US does pull back and is no longer a leader, and that when, you know, representatives of the free world are no longer standing up to dictators who are increasingly powerful on the international stage, then what happens is that a lot of the norms end up getting shaped by Chinese diplomats, by Russian diplomats. You know, that has an impact on not only their own citizens, you know, a lot of the developing countries in sub-Saharan Africa that are then, you know, where the Chinese have a very, let's say a soft power campaign to warm up to their style of governance. And ultimately, because we live in a globalized world where especially the internet is interconnected, it ends up affecting us in one way or another. So it's something that we all need to be a little bit aware of, is how can the US be, you know, a smart actor at the international stage, standing up for things like, you know, democracy, human rights, openness, and doing it in a way where we are working together with other countries, particularly other democracies, in order to have a sort of a positive vision for what the internet can be, what a global community can be. And unfortunately, I hate to keep pointing out China, but they're doing a really good job at selling themselves as an alternative to many populations, to many countries out there. As a, you don't need to worry about the human rights stuff. You don't need to worry about the democracy. We have an alternative. Look how great things are here in China.
Well, and I think it's really important. It's obviously not the topic of this panel, but it's not just the government, right? Like there's also, when you have a laissez-faire market, much like the tech market in the United States, it becomes an easy place for Chinese investment to play. And I think it's always surprising to me how few people in the technology industry realize that it's not a matter of if your Chinese dev is going to get back to the government, it's a matter of when, it's a matter of how it will be used, because the law requires it in China. And as long as we have, right, so it's not just not showing up and the government not doing the lawmaking, but also an industry allows, any laissez-faire industry is going to invite that. Because dictators will move into the vacuum to accomplish their objectives. We've covered a lot of ground. We have a lot of ground to cover, but I want to talk about sort of what comes next and sort of wrap up our conversation. Laura, you mentioned at the top, and I think it's really a good place for us to start on just how popular a lot of the tools that you're working on are. And isn't that good? Doesn't that mean that that the good guys are winning and the dictators are losing? And what do you see in terms of where we go from here? Oh, you're muted. It has to happen once on every call.
So close. We were almost through the whole panel. Yeah. So, I mean, certainly OTF looks at a lot of things from a tech perspective and making sure that our technologies are accessible and usable to as many people as possible around the world. But I think the way that we actually see our technologies is that they should be the backup plan. They should be the thing that you have when everything else fails. And I am really concerned that the fact that our technologies are used by 2 billion people around the world actually demonstrates that there is a huge normative and policy failing that is happening here. I think the ideal model that we all look towards when it comes to human rights is that it is government's responsibility to protect human rights. It's companies' responsibilities to respect human rights. And only when those two things fail should citizens have to fall back on the types of circumvention and secure communication technologies that OTF supports. Rather than seeing, government stepping up and companies stepping up to solve some of these problems and having OTF technology become less and less necessary, we're seeing the exact opposite. We're seeing more demand than ever and more need than ever for the types of technologies that we support. And frankly, I think that's a really troubling indication of where norms are going right now in the technology space. I think, I would like to see a world where we are starting to build norms and policies that are proactive when it comes to technology. For so long, we have reacted to technology from a policy perspective. The US and Europe have really struggled to come up with what their vision for technology is going to be going forward, to develop norms around that, to develop policies around that. And as a result, a huge gap has been created. And we're trying to use technology and the tools that we support kind of as a Band-Aid to fill that gap. That's unfortunately not feasible long-term, nor is it sustainable, nor is it a healthy way for governments and businesses to support citizens and their users. So, I think we are here to do OTF's work of making sure those technologies exist. But I think the ideal outcome is that we eventually put ourselves out of business. That those first two, lines of defense when it comes to human rights, governments and companies are the ones that are starting to hold the line and defend and protect those really critical rights, and that less and less people actually need to rely on OTF tools to do basic things like express themselves freely or access information. And so I actually think it's a really negative trend that we're seeing. And although, I come at it from the tech world, I guess my kind of call or ask is that we really start thinking and engaging on this from a normative and a policy perspective, because this approach is not going to be sustainable for a lot longer.
Yeah.
Adrian, on that happy note, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, well, I want to celebrate the tech component, because there's been people who've done amazing things on the tech, and I think that this is something generally that we've, this country, the United States, even though I'm currently outside, but is really good at innovating and creating new technologies. I personally think that we lag a little bit on the policy standpoint, and I think that we're right now we are benefiting from a lot of the technological advances from the 90s and early 2000s, and we're sort of riding that wave without tending to too many idioms here, without tending to the garden and sort of understanding what are the negative repercussions of this, what are the ways that we didn't build in, the need for privacy, the need to sort of make sure that when platforms are scaled, users still have some type of control around the speech that they're exposed to, the news articles that they're reading. So, there's a lot that technologists can still do. And I think that there's been amazing progress on that front, even something, like end-to-end encryption, which just like that really expanded the cybersecurity and privacy of billions of internet users around the world. It involved no government legislation. At the same time, I do think that there has to be some legislative effort, some legislative innovation. Right now, a lot of it is coming from our friends across the Atlantic in the European Union, where they're trying to experiment with some regulations. Some of them could be good. Some of them we'll have to wait and see. They could be a little bit problematic, as things are. But credit to a lot of the partners that Freedom House and NDI and other organizations are working with, that are on the front lines here around advocating for better policies in their own countries around how the internet is regulated. It's interesting to me, and maybe to some of our viewers and listeners out there, to think, we have such a negative attitude towards a lot of US tech companies. And, rightly so, for a lot of the ways that they've dropped the ball, either in the United States or in places like, Myanmar, Ethiopia. At the same time, it is interesting that a lot of dictators are capitalizing on that techlash in order to impose all sorts of very repressive restrictions on companies. And it's not really on companies, it's about the users of these products. And so now you have, in Russia and Turkey, Vietnam, even potentially in India, governments that are proposing things like data localization laws that makes data more easily available to law enforcement and the police. That has a chilling effect. They're also, threatening to block Twitter and Facebook and other, US social media apps if they do not comply readily with requests to, remove government criticism. So there's an interesting dynamic happening all over the world. And I think that what I would like to see the United States do is to find a way to actually regulate these companies, to address some of the negative externalities that come from the products, that come from that laissez-faire approach that you mentioned, Moira, in a way that is in line with our democratic model. And I think that will also help to stave off some of these really repressive pieces of legislation that are coming out that are, justified with things like combating disinformation or a rise in hate speech, but they actually don't really achieve that. And instead they're really targeting free expression.
Yeah, obviously I agree with everything you all said. And I think it's really critical to recognize that the experience we have here in the United States is sort of unique in the world. in terms of what the government can and can't do. And those of us who, even throughout Europe, environments that feel more familiar and close to us, the United States is really unique in our ability to operate not only from a speech perspective, from a business perspective as well. And as you said, sort of build platforms, some of which are new and cool and everyone loves right now, that have no content moderation, no requirements on where the dev and the data is going. And so the combined activities of governments as well as corporations is really going to be key here. And then just to put a fine point on it, I would say that you all really highlighted one thing, which is that what we all know, which is that technology can fix a lot of things, but it can't fix a problem society doesn't want to fix. Democracy being one of those things. So I guess to all of our viewers and listeners, unless you all have any last parting thoughts, I will invite all of you to check the chat for some great reports and some further reading, and to follow Adrienne Shabazz on Twitter. And I am at Moira on Twitter, and Laura Hides, but I'm sure has a strong understanding of what's happening there. But you can find
a burner
her
account.
Yeah, you can find her at OTF. And please get to know these issues, reach out to us. The reports are all out there. This is a really awesome community that we want to expand with a lot of great technical leaders at South by. So we were happy to be with you. And next year we will do this with barbecue. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Moira.
Thanks so much, Moira.
Bye, guys.